Hello, ladies and gents. We're on A225, Block 2, Confidence and Crisis, 1840 to 1880, edited by Don Loftus. Page 250, Unit 12, The Making of the British Middle Class, Activity 12.2. Now go to the module website and complete Activity 12.2. Use novels as evidence. This should take around an hour. Middle class people were diverse in terms of occupation and income, and their status range was considerable, but they all, to some extent, managed capital and deepened on credit, and many also employed labour. Even the growing minority of professional people, lawyers, clergymen, and ministers, medical men, accountants, architects, and teachers, deepened on selling their service to the growing middle class. Their fortunes were exposed to the economy and, like shopkeepers, to their ability to attract customers. In this respect, the middle class shared the experience of business and commerce, and its members were often tied together through business networks and other associations of trade. They also shared the experience of opportunity and insecurity that went with commerce. As the middle class grew, it established social networks that helped it manage insecurity and protect its position. Smaller businesses and individual professionals depended on middle class men for work connections made through business, clubs, church, and voluntary societies. Provided access to wider networks of support in Loftus 2017. Support from family was also important to security and success. The joint stock company had little significance in manufacturing until the 20th century. Whether a small business or a large industrial concern, it was the family firm that was typical in the mid-century. Family loans provided initial capital and credit for suppliers, and kin networks were essential in providing personal and partners. All this required trust built on family knowledge extended through social networks. Business success also depended on reputation, hence supporting all members of the family. Choosing marriage partners carefully and mixing in the right circles were all vital to the business. 12.3 Family and Gender. The middle class was associated with self help and social mobility. However, in the turbulent economy of the 19th century, this mobility could mean moving down as well as up. Prospects and strikes could damage businesses. Fears of disorder were stoked in the Chartist era, and as campaigns of parliamentary reform re-emerged in 1860s. There were other, more everyday threats to stability too. Structural changes in the economy and fluctuations in trade could threaten livelihoods. Speculation and fraud were rife, and poor investments could and did lead to bankruptcy. Premature death and chronic ill health could also threaten bankruptcy and throw a middle class family into poverty. New kinds of professions, experts, and services were emerging to provide greater protection for the middle class, even for those who could afford the best doctors. The knowledge of medical men and the availability of medicines were still limited. Checks on banks, merchant houses, stockbrokers, and accountants were also imperfect. As a result, insecurity and anxiety were part of the middle class life, and the middle class often looked to the family to provide security. The family provided a way for the middle class to secure investment and circulate property and capital, and a place where middle class values and culture could be nurtured. Domestic ideology held these two aspects of middle class family life together: family capital and family values. But not, as you'll see, without some tension. The 19th century middle class distinguished itself from working and upper classes by its adoption and adaptation of the early 18th domestic ideology infused by evangelical religion. Domestic ideology preached the separate roles of men and women in the separate spheres of the public and the private. Men were required to work to protect and provide for their family. Women were responsible for the home and for the spiritual and moral rejuvenation of society by nurturing and nourishing their husbands and children. These roles were perceived to be natural and God given. Thus, the man's duty as breadwinner and patriarch was to be complemented by female service and submission. Roles that could be justified through suitable selective quotations from the ever present Bible on family table. As you'll see in this section, domestic ideology operated to create ideal type of middle class family life. Though, as you'll see, things were rarely so simple in practice. 1839, Sarah Stickney Ellis, 1812-1872, published a popular conduct book on middle class women, the women of England, their social duties and domestic habits. Ellis was a non-conformist writer from a rural background. Her father was a Quaker farmer. Yet she perceived that the growing middle class needed some help finding its place in the urban industrial economy. She argued that the middle class must include so fast a portion of the intelligence and moral power of the country at large that it may not improperly be designated the pillar of our nation's strength. Ellis, 1839. She argued that women had been a particular and important part to play in maintaining the virtues of the new middle class. Sarah Stickney Ellis, the woman of England, 1839, located at the end of this unit. What does Ellis think the role of the English middle class woman should be in a modern industrial city? Why does she think this is more important than ever? Ellis thinks that women should stay at home and cultivate domestic life. She thinks this is more important than ever because modern urban life distracts people from the laws of nature. Modern life requires men to spend more and more time in the public world, often in degrading occupations. As a consequence, women are required to spend more time at home, compensating for the corrupting effects of public life on men. However, as you may have also noticed, Ellis acknowledges that supporting fathers and husbands may require women helping out in the family businesses. In many ways, the middle class embrace of domestic ideology in the mid-19th century is a contradiction. As Eric Hobsbawm has argued, middle class society was premised on a cash nexus, freedom, contract, and individualism. Yet the family was based on reciprocity and collective interests. Hobsbawm, 1975. However, John Tosh had argued that these very contradictions hold the clue to the mystery. Tosh, 1999. Domesticity was supposed to encounter the brutality of the highly competitive, corrupt environment in which men had worked. Ellis' conservatism is also an example of what James Vernon has called the dialectic of modernity, where modernisation and new ways of living provoke the defence of habits that some people thought as natural or normal, in this case, nurturing the family. Vernon, 2014. Behind the idolised and sentimental images of middle class domestic life, which you can see in figure 12.5, it lays complex economic negotiations and relationships in which both men and women played their part. Domestic ideology corresponded with the separation of home and work. At the start of the 19th century, family and business were closely intertwined, and household and business accounts were often blended. Shops, workplaces, and offices were near to the home, if not directly connected. And warehouses and finishing shops occupied the backyards of urban houses, for example. In the households of the yeoman clothiers of northern England, the male heads of the household dealt with their tradesmen in the front parlour, while wives managed servants and apprentices in the back. They would be familiar with each other's work, and women might be called on to help out in busy periods. As the century progressed, there was a tendency to adopt more formal accounting procedures, which separated home and business budget and, if possible, separated spaces of work and domestic life entirely. This separation made it harder for women to be involved in business. Despite this, women still provide a hidden investment, given their labour and capital, to ensure business success in an important study. Leonore Davidoff and Catherine Hall have demonstrated that women's labour was essential to the success of many small businesses in the 19th century. The retail trade, in particular, deepened on women running shops, often selling products manufactured or acquired by their husbands. In fact, Davidoff and Hall have found numerous examples of women's contribution to business, from support in times of crisis to everyday help with routine tasks and administration, for example. There were solicitors and estate agents who deepened on wives and daughters to arrange meetings, write letters, and copy correspondence. Davidoff and Hall, 2002, 1987. Women also brought to businesses. In a famous example, George Courtauld, 1761 to 1823, borrowed money from his sister and a female friend to help start his silk mill. When Courtauld married, he and his wife lived off her money so that the profits of the silk mill could be reinvested in the business. Davidoff and Hall, 2002. Women were essential to success in other ways. The middle class home was important in preparing the next generation for achievement. In general, girls were trained for domestic life. Childhood for boys was a period of dependence on parents, but early teens saw a period of training and perhaps education in a grammar school, preparing for further medical or clerical education, perhaps time in one of the modern commercial schools, learning German and bookkeeping. Others would be apprenticed, perhaps, in a mercantile or legal business, or in one of the many manufacturing trades in businesses, large and small. Mothers would help oversee this early training and provide the regularity of routine that allowed character to flourish. Davidoff and Hall. A man's early 20s was a time for important decisions. Most middle class men would enter some form of partnership with a family member or with friends or contacts who could use or invest in their skills. By their later 20s, once the ability to be independent seemed viable, many men would consider marriage, as the economy of family and firm was so closely linked. Marriage was an important step, as the example of Courtauld above illustrates. Family was often a source of the initial capital of many firms in the form of loans or credit, and marriage could be used to extend networks of support. Romantic love was increasingly celebrated in 19th century Britain, but middle class people were strongly encouraged to fall in love with the right sort of person, one who had family capital, brothers, and extended networks that could be trusted. Middle class people support the family through wills and inheritance. Although an extended family of cousins, nephews, and nieces may have been useful in establishing business networks, when it came to inheritance, the middle class prioritised the nuclear family. Laws of inheritance in England favoured the eldest son, but the middle class typically used wills to protect other members of the family and ensure a degree of control over their future. Provision was also made for a widow and for daughters, usually by investing a share of the estate in a trust. Such trusts were invested in government stock, railway and other joint stock shares, in mortgage bonds, or in the purchase of property. In this way, female capital was an important source of finance for more urban property. for the family business and for other business in locality and beyond. In most cases, trust conditions specified that women's income was independent of the control of any husband. However, the law of England and Wales meant that a married woman had no legal existence in terms of property separately from her husband. As one campaigner for a reform of law, Francis Powell Code 1822-94 stated, the husband and wife are assumed to be one person, and that person is the husband. The wife can make no contract and can neither sue or be sued. Whatever she possesses of personal property at the time of her marriage, or whatever she may afterwards earn or inherit, belongs to her husband without control on her part. Francis Power Code, Criminals, Idiots, Women and Minors, 1869. In this extract, Cobb imagines explaining the concept of marriage to an alien. What impression does she create of what marriage means for women in the mid-19th century? Cobb uses dialogue to espouse the unequal statement of marriage for women. She contrasts the idealised image of marriage in mid-Victorian culture with reality in which the sweet young woman in white has no more rights than a criminal or minor. Cobb argues that this model of marriage is out of date. Women are more active and useful in modern age, where force and violence are no longer required for conducting one's business. As such, women can play part in managing their affairs, and that part should be recognised. Unlike Ellis, Cobb did not argue for the return to a natural balance between the genders, with defined roles of authority on behalf of men and submission for women. Instead, she argued that the law and human relationships needed to be modernised to catch up with wider changes in society. In her extended argument, she referred to new specific discoveries such as Charles Darwin's Original of Species, 1859, to argue that as nature had evolved to fit with changed environment, so too should human society. Cobb was writing as the Married Women's Property Act was being discussed in Parliament. The Act was intended to allow women the right to own and control their property after marriage. It was passed in 1870, allowing women to keep the money they earned and to inherit property. Domestic ideology was an important part of middle-class culture, which the separation of spheres was presented as essential in balancing the economic and moral aspects of life. The family was the site where the corrupting aspects of public activity were neutralised through cultivation of manners, spiritually and affection. However, historians need to get beyond the ideas of middle-class family life that were discussed in domestic manuals and perspective literature, and popularise the sentimentalist scenes of domestic life. Middle-class men were actively involved in family life, and even if domestic ideology made middle-class women's work less respectable, it was still accepted as necessary by even the most strident promoters of separate spheres such as Ellis, Tosh, 1999. Detailed local studies have shown that women made up a sizable chunk of entrepreneurs running successful businesses in the mid-19th century. Ashton, 2016. Economic historians have capital. Moreover, middle-class women were able to reinterpret domestic ideology and their role as carers and educators in the home to carve out the public role. As the urban middle class began to campaign for social reform, the opportunities for middle-class women's work increased through charities, poor law boards, and after passing of the Elementary Education Act of 1870, local schools boards. Domestic ideology can obscure the many complex ways that public and private work and family were intertwined in the period, as detailed empirical studies of wills and inheritance have shown. The family was the primary mechanism for transferring wealth, and marriage at the extended family were used to develop the networks of support that helped secure business success. Owens, 2001. It was also the site where the next generation were groomed and the appearances of respectability cultivated. Image and materiality combined in middle class family life behind sentimental images of respectability, laid complex strategies for securing class privilege into the next generation. Page 258. The making of the British middle class. The middle class spaces. By the mid 19th century, as the middle class was growing in influence, its members began to shape the world around them to reflect their interest and identity and to help them protect the wealth and status they had acquired. A middle class could be found in the most communities, however, their impact was most notable in urban industrial towns and cities. Here, middle class culture could be seen in housing developments, in civic buildings such as halls and libraries, and in clubs and voluntary associations formed to promote self help and social reform. Such spaces were created by the middle class, but they also helped to create middle class sense of the world. The idea of the separate spheres was an important part of middle class culture, albeit one of the difficult to maintain in practice. Nevertheless, in the mid-century, new villas were built in leafy suburbs a short distance from places of work. Edgbaston in Birmingham, Victoria Park in Manchester, and Headingley in Leeds were all built for the new middle class. They were intended to be close enough to work to allow the breadwinner an easy commute at a time when quick transport links were yet to be established, but far enough away to allow for a genuine separation. Many different types of houses were built in these suburbs to accommodate the varying economic and social status of middle class families. Many were bespoke, designed by architects for the upper ranks of the middle class. Others were speculations built in anticipation of a growing market. Builders who undertook these relied on a variety of pattern books produced in the mid-century in response to the sharp increase in demand for more houses. These books demonstrate how houses were constructed to reflect the way that middle-class people thought about themselves in terms of social status. In 1860, the architect Samuel H. Brooks published his rudimentary treatise on the erection of dwelling houses. His book was a guide to builders on how to erect a pair of semi-detached villas. The villas would be 4 stories high and contain 4 bedrooms. The guide contained advice on the layout, drainage, brickwork, and even decoration of a new house. It included floor plans and measurements, and diagrams to help builders with drains and sewage systems. What do you notice about the way Brooks describes streets and buildings? Brooks thinks that streets and buildings reflect what people think and feel and can, in turn, shape the way that people think and feel as such. He advises builders to reflect the values and identity of the people they are building for. He also thinks that buildings represent the nation and its history. He claims that the middle class is the heart of the nation. And he says the British are a commercial people and a common sense trading race, and buildings need to reflect that.